Also today we're going to be looking at Emily Dickinson's poem, The Wind Began to Rock the Grass. As you can see, she lived from 1830 to 1886. I think one of the most important things one needs to realize about Emily Dickinson is the fact that she was a very reclusive person. Right? She preferred solitude, she focused on her inner world. In fact, she spent most of her life in a little room in her father's house. And in fact, she used to communicate with people through the door of the house. So she kept to herself a lot. And through her life, she only published around about 10 poems. They've discovered many poems after her death, around about 1,800 poems. So she really wrote a lot of poems. And those that were published in her lifetime were published anonymously, sometimes possibly without her knowing either. Right, let's begin to read the poem The Wind Began to Rock the Grass. The wind began to rock the grass with threatening tunes and low. He threw a menace at the earth, a menace at the sky. The leaves unhooked themselves from trees and started all abroad. The dust did scoop itself like hands and threw away the road. The wagons quickened on the streets, the thunder hurried slow. The lightning showed a yellow beak and then a livid claw. The birds put up the bars to nests, the cattle fled to barns. There came one drop of giant rain, and then as if the hands that held the dams had parted, hold the waters wrecked the sky, but overlooked my father's house, just quartering a tree. So the first thing to look at in terms of structure is the use of half rhyme through the poem. Now we'll see that it is used in the second stanza with abroad and road, slow and claw in the third stanza, barns and hands in the next stanza, and sky and tree in the final stanza. Now remember, half rhyme is a rhyme that doesn't quite rhyme perfectly, but it's got a very similar sound to it. Then the next thing to have a look at is the use of dashes through the poem over here. Now, Emily Dickinson doesn't use these dashes as a way of creating a pause, but rather as a way of showing an action that's ongoing. Now, if you think of this as almost like a snapshot of a storm that's menacing the earth, menacing the environment, and so on. So each of these moments in the storm are constantly ongoing. The next thing we need to look at is the use of iambic meter through the course of the poem. Now, just to jog your memory, iambic meter, as we all know, starts on an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, and our first and third line in each stanza is written in iambic tetrameter. In other words, there are 8 syllables or 4 feet, and the second and the fourth line in each stanza is written in iambic trimeter, which has 6 syllables and 3 feet. And what this does is it makes a very readable poem, and it kind of almost subdivides each stanza into groups of 2 lines. Right, so as we get into the first line of the poem, we get the statement, the wind began to rock the grass. And of course, the first thing that comes to mind is something like the image in the bottom right hand side of your screen over there, which is of the wind blowing across a field of grass, rocking the grass backwards and forwards over there. And what Emily Dickinson has done here is use the word begun instead of began. This gives us this kind of impression of a sudden start, first of all, and also because it's almost the incorrect word to use, it kind of unsettles the reader from the beginning. The next word to take note of in that line is the word rock. Now, the word rock usually has kind of nurturing aspects to it. Think of if you had to rock a baby, rock on a rocking chair, rock to sleep. Okay, so it's normally quite a mellow and quite a soft action or word. But as we move into the second stanza, we see that that is actually undermined by the growing threat of the storm. Okay, as we can see here, there's the word threatening in line 2, and with that word we start to realize the ominous nature of the wind and the storm. It's something that actually seriously poses a threat. Now remember, this poem is a kind of snapshot of a storm passing over. All right, and in the storm, and if you think about it, when there's a gale force wind blowing or there's a storm that comes in, there's tunes, there's sound to it. Okay, the sound of the wind whistling and blowing, the low rumbling of the thunder. Okay, so these are all sounds of the storm as it moves in. Also remember to take note of the use of the dashes over there to indicate this constant movement over here. And of course here we have this movement of the wind, something that's ongoing, the sounds that are ongoing. With this dash we see that there's this menace that's constantly, it's an ongoing thing that gets thrown at the earth. Which brings us into our third line. We have this personification of the storm in the first word. He threw a menace at the earth over here. So it almost like gives the sense that the storm is something that has intent. Okay, just as a person would have intent, the storm has intent over here. And what does he throw? Notice it's a menace. Okay, this is quite a violent word. Okay, to have a menace, it means that things are at risk. Okay, they're threatened or put at risk. And you'll notice there that there's a repetition in both those lines over there, and this strengthens that sense of menace. And you can see that it's not just the earth that's at threat, it's also the sky, which kind of gives us this magnitude, a sense of magnitude of the storm, that it's something that doesn't just threaten the earth, it threatens both the earth and the sky. In other words, all of existence is threatened by the storm. As we get into the next stanza, we start to see the effect of the wind on the trees and on the road. All right, so of course, when the wind blows, one doesn't see the wind itself, one only sees the consequences of the wind. And this is something that Dickinson brings across very well in this stanza here, where we have the leaves unhooking themselves from trees. Okay, so it's almost like one gets the impression that these leaves are simply hanging on hooks and they can just simply unhook themselves from the trees. Okay, so we get the sense that you don't see the wind, you see the action of the wind. And there's a nice little image on the left hand side there that kind of portrays that type of sentiment there. And what happens with these leaves is that they start all abroad, so there's this sense of motion. And to go abroad means to travel fast. So this wind is really blowing these leaves a very far distance over there. Notice once again the use of the dash there to indicate an action that is ongoing. In the next section of the stanza, we see the reference to the road. And once again, we don't see the wind itself, we only see the consequences of the wind. And it says here that the dust did scoop itself like hands. And we get this image created here of great dust clouds being blown off of the road over there. But notice here that it scooped itself. Okay, this is where we get this sense that it's the wind doing it, but we can't see the wind, so we only see the actions of the wind. All right. Notice the use of simile. Okay, comparing the scooping up of the dust by the wind to hands scooping up the dust. We also have a partial personification over here, just a reference to hands over there. That's of course the wind itself that's doing it. And what the wind does is that it throws away the road. It says and threw away the road. And there's once again quite a violent action in that word through. Okay, so one gets a sense of the wind, or the storm in this case, being quite violent. Okay, and of course it seems with the amount of dust that's being blown around that the road itself is being blown away. Our next stanza starts with the line, the wagons quickened on the streets. Now, of course, here it's not the wagons that are panicking and moving faster, but the people inside the wagons. Because that's an important distinction to make over there. But one gets a sense of urgency in this line. Okay, things are moving faster, people are moving faster. They're trying to get off the streets and they're trying to get home to shelter from the storm. Okay, now this word quickened over here emphasizes that sense of panic, right? It emphasizes that sense of urgency to get off the streets and to get some shelter from the storm. And on our next line, we see this use of oxymoron over here. And of course, just as a reminder, oxymoron is when two words of opposite meanings are placed next to each other. And this is a very good use of oxymoron over here if one thinks about it, because at first it seems illogical. The thunder hurried slow. But if you think about it, when lightning strikes and the thunderclap comes straight afterwards, the thunder hits suddenly, and then there's the slow rumbling afterwards. All right, so this is a very effective use of oxymoron over here. And once again, note the use of the dash over there to accentuate the ongoing thunder. The following line shows a metaphor comparing the lightning that's striking in the storm to the yellow beak of a bird. Now, if you think about how a bird acts when it's pecking on the ground and would walk along, and as its beak hits the ground, it's very similar to the lightning striking and hitting the ground. So we have a very effective metaphor over there. And we also have a metaphor in our final line of the stanza there, comparing the forked lightning to the claw of a bird. Okay. Now think of, especially if it's a bird of prey, think of the claw of a bird, the kind of damage that it can do. Okay, it's something sharp, it's something aggressive, it can scar, it can injure. Okay, so we have that kind of sense all embodied in the word claw over there. And a very interesting use of the word livid here. Livid, of course, means to be angry, fuming, or raging. The word actually comes from being bruised or battered. Okay, so we get this very angry word over here, and this gives us once again this sense of the storm itself being angry. Now the sense of urgency that we saw in the previous stanza is continued in this stanza here with the birds and the cattle. So we first of all told you that the birds put up the bars to nests. Okay, so to bar up their nest means to try and reinforce the nests. Okay, so they're trying to strengthen it against the storm. And of course, if one thinks about it, a nest is a place of safety, a place of comfort for the birds, just like the barns are for the cattle over here. Notice the use of our dashes once again to show and a continuing action. So just like the birds are panicking and trying to reinforce their nests, the cattle are fleeing to barns. Now, this word fled here, or to flee, means to run away in panic, or to be scared of something and to run away. So these cattle are obviously scared of the oncoming storm and are trying to find refuge in their place of safety, which is the barns. Our following line mentions that one drop of giant rain came. Now, as so often happens with storms or rain showers, there's very often just a little or a drop of rain or one or two drops of rain, and then suddenly there's this huge deluge. And this is exactly what happens here. And our next line says, and then as if the hands that held the dams had parted, hold the waters wrecked the sky. So we've got this sense here, we've noticed the enjambment here, we have this run-on line because this is something ongoing, and there's this image here of hands, almost like the sluice gates of a dam, holding back the waters in the sky, and then they part. Okay, so it says that the hands that held the dams had parted, and what happens then, just like if sluice gates had to open and the water rushes out the dam, these hands parted in the sky and the waters wrecked the sky. Okay, it started raining very heavily. Now notice here this word wrecked once again here. It's a very violent action. In other words, the rain is so intense that it's almost like it's wrecking the sky. On last two lines, we see the speaker's sense of shelter and refuge. It says here, but overlooked my father's house. All right, so here we get the sense of Dickinson's own voice coming through here. Just like she was a recluse and she found safety and refuge in being a recluse in her father's house. That's what happens with the speaker over here. The storm overlooks the father's house. In other words, it bypasses the father's house with a little dash over there, and it says, ends off saying, just quartering a tree. Now, to quarter something means to divide it into four, but there are also other connotations to this word quartering. It's something that was done to people when they tortured them, and they would literally rip their limbs apart. So this poem ends off with this very violent image of what the lightning and what the storm does to a tree. Now, if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please subscribe. There will be more on the way. Have a great day.